Homeowners associations always thought they were untouchable, little governments ruling over freshly mowed lawns and cookie-cutter houses. They hid behind their bylaws and fines, convinced that anyone with land nearby must bow to their authority. For years, I kept my distance. My ranch sat just outside the border of Cedar Ridge Estates, a gated suburban development that sprang up about a decade ago. It was the kind of place where every mailbox was identical, and every resident smiled through clenched teeth, afraid their neighbor might rat them out to the board for leaving a garbage bin out too long. Meanwhile, my ranch remained a stark contrast to that world. Miles of pasture, old oak trees that had stood longer than any of the residents had been alive, and a creek that ran pure and cold through the heart of my property. My grandparents left it to me, their life's work, with one simple request: protect our land. And that's exactly what I always intended to do. Cedar Ridge never liked the sight of me. To them, my ranch was an unkempt blemish on their otherwise carefully curated existence. They preferred to forget the natural world existed beyond their perfect vinyl fences. Still, I minded my own business, and for the most part, they minded theirs. Or so I believed. Everything changed the morning I found the flags. Neon pink surveying markers stabbed into the dirt like tiny insults, marching in a straight line across my western pasture. The cattle avoided them, unsettled by the unfamiliar scent and the sudden intrusion. I knelt and pulled one from the ground, reading the small white label, CRW Project Boundary. I didn't know what the acronym stood for at first, though I'd soon learned to hate it. The week that followed became a waking nightmare of activity. Heavy equipment rolled in with no warning. Excavators, trenchers, dump trucks carrying long steel pipes. Workers in bright vests and white helmets swarmed my property like locusts. They weren't lost. They weren't confused. They were building something, and they were very much on schedule. No one knocked on my door. No letters arrived. The HOA president, a sharp-faced woman named Marlene, who always looked like she'd tasted something sour, kept her gaze cold and distant whenever I drove past the community entrance. Not a word spoken, not a hint given, just an unspoken expectation that I wouldn't make a fuss. Their assumption was their first mistake. From a distance, I watched the construction, the trench cutting deeper each day. The pipeline stretched like a metallic serpent, inching its way across my land without permission. I photographed everything, logged every disruption, documented every footprint they left behind. But something bothered me more than the trespassing itself. The pipeline wasn't arbitrary. It ran parallel to the creek, the same creek that fed into the reservoir farther north, a reservoir controlled by a regional water supplier. The realization dawned slowly. This wasn't for irrigation or city utilities. It was a private line, a project funded by the HOA, a lifeline they intended to control. Curiosity turned to suspicion. Late one evening, when the workers had gone home and only the rumble of distant traffic broke the silence, I followed the path of the pipeline toward Cedar Ridge Estates. It stopped abruptly at a fenced-off pump station, newly installed and guarded by cameras and motion-activated lights. A sign hung on the gate: Cedar Ridge Water Authority, private property. No trespassing.crw. Cedar Ridge Water. So the HOA had decided to become their own utility provider, their own kingdom with their own water. And they believed the best route, the only feasible route, was through my ranch. Their arrogance would have been laughable if the damage weren't so real. Fences cut, soil torn apart, old tree roots exposed and dying under the sun. Still, I waited, because patience was my greatest weapon. The next day, I drove into town. Instead of storming the HOA office like they expected, I visited the county assessor, the clerk's office, and finally the Water Regulatory Authority. I requested maps, permits, contracts, anything that legally documented their right to touch my land. There was nothing. no easement, no agreement, no application filed under my property parcel number. They had built first and worried about the law second. When I learned who owned Cedar Ridge Water Authority, the pieces clicked into place. It wasn't some large corporation. It wasn't a public utility. It was a shell company, one established barely 6 months ago, and on its list of stakeholders was a familiar name: Marlene Parker, HOA president. The HOA wasn't just flexing power. They were investing, planning to profit, selling water access directly to the community at prices they controlled, all at my expense. I could have shut them down right then and there with a single call to the authorities. But again, patience. Because while they thought they were clever, they had overlooked one crucial fact. I wasn't just a landowner. I was also the largest shareholder, the silent majority stakeholder, in High Plains Water Corporation. The regional supplier Cedar Ridge had relied on for years, a company that handled nearly every gallon flowing into this county, a company that could, if necessary, dry Cedar Ridge to a crisp. My grandfather didn't just leave me the ranch. He left me his seat at the head of one of the most powerful utilities in the state. The HOA had built a pipeline through my property to replace the very water they were buying from me. They thought they were cutting me out. Instead, they had built their entire project on top of my land and under my control. All I had to do was watch them spend money. Let them dig deeper. Let them finish. Then, when the line was complete and fully reliant on the creek's flow, I would decide whether water ran through it at all. But revenge, like water pressure, must build slowly. I returned home that evening, stood at the edge of the trench, and breathed in the scent of freshly turned earth. The sun dipped behind the houses in the distance, casting their manicured lawns in long shadows. For the first time, Cedar Ridge felt small. The workers would resume construction tomorrow, unaware of the trap closing around them. Marlene would continue sipping her expensive bottled water, proud of her accomplishment. And the HOA board would celebrate soon enough, believing they had secured independence. Meanwhile, I prepared my next move, because a lesson was coming. One written not in bylaws or fines, but in water, or the lack of it. And as I turned to walk back toward the ranch house, a slow smile formed. They had no idea who they were messing with. The rumble of engines returned at dawn. I stood on the porch with a mug of coffee as the construction crew gathered like ants at the trench line, picking up exactly where they'd left off. They still hadn't bothered to acknowledge me. No questions, no apologies, not even a nod in my direction. The audacity of people who believed paper authority was stronger than land and legacy never failed to amuse me. The pipeline advanced each day, inching toward the creek intake point. They worked with urgency, the kind born from deadlines and fear of oversight. It was clear they wanted this project hidden, completed before anyone could question it. They assumed I was just another powerless rural relic, a man clinging to old dirt, while progress marched unchallenged. Their ignorance was becoming a theme. A temporary pump station was assembled near the creek by midweek, a squat metal building surrounded by chain-link fencing. They carved a concrete support into the bank, rerouting part of the stream into a filtration basin not 20 yards from where my grandfather once taught me to fish. I wondered what he would have thought of all this. He had always taken a grim view of those who tried to bend nature to greed. He would have called Cedar Ridge Estates a paper paradise, built by people who didn't understand the land but insisted on ruling it. Watching them, I felt a tug. Not just anger, but insult. They weren't simply invading my property. They were violating my family's promise to protect it. Still, I waited. If I had intervened too early, their fallback options would remain intact. Only when they were trapped by their own actions, financially and operationally, would I strike. But they weren't content to do damage quietly. The HOA took their hostility public. The first message arrived in my mailbox, a neatly printed violation notice, accusing me of unsightly property conditions, visible from the Cedar Ridge community. They complained that my fences were weathered, my cattle too close to the boundary, and that a rusted water trough diminished property values. I laughed when I read it. My ranch wasn't even in their jurisdiction. They had no authority here. But the message wasn't about legal standing. It was intimidation, a warning shot. The second letter followed 2 days later, thicker, with threats. Failure to comply may result in legal enforcement actions, including but not limited to property liens. Their desperation was showing. At the convenience store on the edge of town, I overheard residents whispering at the counter. Rumors swirled that I was refusing to cooperate, that I was blocking progress crucial for the community's well-being. Someone claimed I was extorting the HOA for money. Another said I'd turned the creek into a private resource out of spite. It didn't matter whether the lies were believable. In HOA culture, perception becomes reality the instant a board member repeats it with confidence. The board, especially Marlene, needed a villain. It made them heroes. Soon, passive aggression gave way to direct action. One evening, I found new fencing partially erected across part of my property. A pointless attempt to extend the HOA boundary, as if they were claiming sovereignty over land that wasn't theirs to touch. Another day, a group of residents parked near the construction site, staring, pointing at me like sightseeing tourists. They came in their khakis and polos, clutching HOA newsletters as if scripture. Some lifted their phones to record me on my own land. Their stares asked the same question. Who does this man think he is, standing in the way? If only they knew. Rather than confront them, I let them stew in their confusion. Because my silence was its own power. Their assumption that I was powerless only made their impending realization sweeter. Behind the scenes, my influence was already shifting tides. I had quietly instructed the Operations Division at High Plains Water Corporation to begin reviews of Cedar Ridge's consumption metrics and billing forecasts. The numbers no longer added up. Their demand was spiking while payments drifted behind. It raised red flags, ones that mandated regulatory reporting. Just like that, Cedar Ridge became the subject of a compliance inquiry. At the same time, I ordered a full audit on infrastructure redundancies, specifically regarding unapproved new lines on land without easements. The moment a single inspection occurred, that pipeline would be flagged as illegal. Work would halt. Penalties would be issued, but I wasn't going to report it yet. They needed to believe they had succeeded, only when they had completely transitioned dependency onto the pipeline. Only when shutting it down would devastate them would I pull the plug. The board had overestimated the strength of their paper fortress. They believed a well-worded threat could move mountains and men alike. They were right about some people. But not me. My patience was about to pay dividends. On a Friday afternoon, as golden light washed over the pasture, I saw Marlene herself arrive. She stepped out of her luxury SUV in heels far too impractical for dirt. Her sunglasses shielded her eyes, but not the judgment in her posture. She surveyed the construction like a queen overseeing conquest. The workers hovered near her, nodding as she spoke, likely congratulating her progress, reassuring her that everything was under control. She had the self-satisfied stance of someone who believed their plan had succeeded, that her name would be etched in the HOA newsletter as the visionary who saved Cedar Ridge from water tyranny. She glanced toward my house. Our eyes met across the field. She smiled, a polite smile, sharp as a blade, a declaration of war. I returned the gaze with calm neutrality, giving her nothing. Let her think I had already lost. Let her believe she had won. Let that confidence become her downfall. As twilight fell, the workers packed up for the weekend. The pipeline now lay complete from the creek to Cedar Ridge's reservoir intake. They just needed to test and activate the system. I stood beside the creek, boots sinking slightly into the soft mud. The cool water flowed past, unaware it was about to become the object of a tug-of-war. The line was ready. The trap was set. Soon they would flip the switch and become completely dependent on my water. A decision approached, like the slow turn of a massive valve. I could feel the weight of the coming moment. Not just revenge, but justice. A reckoning for those who believed ownership was defined by paperwork rather than responsibility. As night embraced the ranch, stars scattered across the sky like scattered truths waiting to be revealed. I breathed deeply, the scent of grass and creek water, grounding me. The next phase of the battle would not be fought with machines or fences or petty notices. Ain't roundly would be fought with control of the one resource Cedar Ridge could not survive. Without, their pipeline was complete. Now, all I had to do was close my hand around the flow. Monday morning arrived with a stillness that didn't belong. The construction crew returned first, their trucks kicking dust into the sunrise. The final fittings were secured, the last bolts tightened. A small group of HOA board members gathered at the edge of the development to witness their accomplishment. There were smiles, camera flashes, and an air of celebration. They were about to turn on their new independence. I watched from the far fence line as the pump station hummed to life. Workers nodded at one another, proud, confident, unaware they were activating a monument to their own hubris. Water surged into the pipeline, pressurizing the system. The creek's surface rippled as the intake began to pull. Down the line, valves opened and water flowed toward the pristine lawns of Cedar Ridge Estates. For a brief moment, victory belonged to them. Sprinklers danced along neatly trimmed grass. A fountain in their community park sprang to life, its water arching high like a triumphant salute. Residents cheered, posting pictures to social media with captions proclaiming freedom from the unreliable old water supply. Their celebration was loud, obnoxious, and short-lived, because while they admired the show, they had not yet received the letter. It had been sent early that morning from the headquarters of High Plains Water Corporation, addressed to the Cedar Ridge HOA Board, with urgent regulatory markings. Inside, a calm but chilling message awaited. Effective immediately, High Plains Water was suspending all water deliveries to Cedar Ridge Estates due to unresolved contractual violations and unauthorized infrastructure modifications. Service would not resume until compliance was restored, which, of course, they could not restore. They had dismantled their legal connection and placed their trust entirely in a pipeline that stood on my land without permission, drawing water solely at my discretion. At precisely 2 p.m., after their sprinklers had run for a few joyous hours, I made a phone call to a very specific supervisor at the creek monitoring station. A simple instruction was given: shut the intake valve. The flow stopped instantly. The fountain sputtered. Sprinklers hissed out the last droplets. Residents stepped out onto wilting turf, confused. They tapped their faucets at home. A few drips, then nothing. A strange panic swept the neighborhood. Phones lit up. Text chains exploded. The HOA board rushed from house to house, knocking on doors, assuring residents everything was under control, while clearly having no idea what was happening. From my vantage point, I saw Marlene march toward the pump station, barking orders at the workers who stared helplessly at silent machinery. Her triumphant smile from days before was gone, replaced by tightening worry lines around her mouth. Control was slipping from her grasp. The board gathered in an emergency meeting that evening. Lights flickered inside the HOA clubhouse as voices rose in a frantic storm. Papers waved through the air. Fingers pointed. Every solution offered ended the same way. They needed permission from the landowner. From me. That realization didn't settle quietly. It hit them like an earthquake, one that shattered the illusion of their authority. By nightfall, the first message appeared on my door. A formal request for a meeting. Very polite, almost humble. They asked if I could spare a moment to discuss mutually beneficial solutions regarding the current water supply disruption. I didn't reply. The next day brought more chaos. Without irrigation, their lawns, the pride of Cedar Ridge, began to fade in the summer heat. Brown spots appeared like bruises across an otherwise perfect facade. Residents complained in louder, more desperate tones. Social media posts turned from celebration to outrage, tagging the HOA board with accusations and panicked questions. The board cracked. Overnight, they went from arrogant rulers to scrambling bureaucrats. More letters appeared in my mailbox, each increasingly frantic. They offered compensation, negotiations, promises to restore property boundaries. They wrote about partnership, collaboration, and community cohesion. Every plea dripped with the same silent message. Please give us back our water. But I was in no rush to respond. The longer the lawns dried and the fountains sat empty, the more Cedar Ridge understood that water wasn't just a utility, it was power. And power was something they no longer had. Marlene paid me a visit in person on the third day. She marched up my porch, knocking sharply, posture stiff but without the smugness she once wielded like a shield. Through the window, I saw her glancing around, nervously, as if expecting unseen eyes to judge her presence here. She waited several minutes, leaving only when she realized the door would not open. The ranch remained calm and green. My cattle drank freely from troughs filled by a private well. My land, untouched by their arrogance, thrived. Late that evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, I stood once more by the silent pump station. The HOA had placed hastily printed signs around the neighborhood, claiming technical upgrades in progress. A weak lie. A few angry residents crossed the boundary, demanding answers from the workers who had none. Shouting carried all the way to the creek. The illusion of community harmony was dissolving fast, and with every passing hour, the stakes climbed. Yet, for all the turmoil, the HOA still clung to one final hope: negotiation. They believed that I, like them, would eventually choose convenience over principle. They had no idea how much resolve this land had built into me. The creek flowed quietly under the moonlight, oblivious to the political war it fueled. I placed my hand on the intake valve enclosure. Cold steel. Cold control. How easily humans forgot the value of resources they didn't have to fight for. Cedar Ridge had trespassed, destroyed, lied, and threatened. And now they were learning. There are consequences for trying to conquer what you do not own. Soon, they would beg not just for water, but forgiveness. But I wasn't finished, because the worst hadn't even begun. For now, I turned my back on the pipeline and walked toward home. Unhurried, steady, knowing desperation would grow thicker in the air with each passing day. Let them suffer a while longer. Let them understand what dependence really feels like. They built a pipeline to steal what wasn't theirs. And now, they could drown in their own arrogance, without a single drop to drink. Cedar Ridge Estates was no longer the pristine model neighborhood it once bragged about being. 5 days without water turned their delicate suburban order into chaos. The lawns that once glowed bright and enviable now lay patchy and defeated, scorched by the relentless sun. The HOA newsletter, usually filled with passive-aggressive reminders about trash bins and acceptable mailbox colors, arrived. Instead, with urgent water usage reduction guidelines. though there was no water left to reduce. Residents filled large plastic storage, bins from swimming pools just to flush their toilets. Garden hoses sat limp and dusty on cracked driveways. Decorative fountains stood stagnant and murky, breeding algae where pride once sparkled. These people had never lived a day without convenience, and suddenly their kingdom of control was crumbling into piles of dying grass and resentment. I watched their downfall unfold from my porch, sipping morning coffee while their panic slowly brewed into hostility. The HOA board held constant meetings, panicked huddles behind clubhouse doors that used to echo with smug confidence. I imagined Marlene pacing with clipped anger, firing accusations at anyone who dared state the obvious truth. She had gambled the entire neighborhood's livelihood on a pipeline that didn't belong to her. What a sight that must have been. On the 6th day, an emergency town hall was held outdoors. Ironic, considering most residents now begrudged even stepping outside to witness their wilting landscapes. Folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle under the community gazebo. Tempers simmered beneath overpriced sunglasses as the crowd waited for answers they already feared. I stayed just beyond the oak trees along the boundary, far enough to go unnoticed, but close enough to hear the eruption as it happened. The meeting began with excuses. Then came finger-pointing. Someone shouted that the HOA dues should cover emergency water access. Another complained that their home value had plummeted overnight. A third demanded immediate action, slamming their fist on an armrest as if the wood itself was to blame. Then Marlene stood, stiff-backed, voice thinning under the weight of her unraveling authority. She cleared her throat and delivered the news. They needed the ranch owners' cooperation. The uproar that followed was nearly feral. Years of bottled suburban aggression exploded into demands and threats. The board urged calm, but the crowd turned wild with entitlement. After all, these were people accustomed to control. They didn't understand why the world wasn't bending to their needs as usual. By sunset, a new narrative stormed through the community. I was the villain keeping them hostage. They called me selfish, unreasonable, a troublemaker who didn't care about community welfare. They pretended to forget that the land I protected had nourished them for years. Quietly, consistently, and legally. As the evening darkened, a convoy of HOA board members drove up to my ranch gate. It was almost endearing how they still believed formal presentations and clipboards could fix this. They honked twice, signaling importance. I didn't bother to greet them. They waited. They honked again. Eventually, they slid yet another envelope through the gate slats, this time thick with proposals for financial compensation. They offered to purchase the portion of land containing the pipeline. They suggested a revenue-sharing plan. They even floated the idea of naming the HOA's main boulevard after my family in an attempt to sweeten their desperation with empty honors. I didn't open the envelope right away. I didn't need to. I already knew what was inside. Words written from the perspective of people who still believed money could buy justice, respect, and forgiveness. Money, however, wasn't the issue. The issue was arrogance. They had crossed my land. They had violated my boundaries. They had treated everything I valued like an inconvenience. But worst of all, they thought I was beneath them. That night, vandalism arrived like a coward in the dark. Signs along my fence lines were ripped down. Spray paint stained the boards. "Give us back our water." Farther along the boundary, broken glass glittered in the moonlight beside tire tracks where someone had attempted to ram through the gate before losing their nerve. I made a note of every detail, every petty strike. The HOA wasn't just losing a battle over utilities. They were losing their masks, revealing teeth beneath the forced smiles of suburban civility. To them, justice meant getting what they wanted by any means necessary. But I wasn't giving an inch. While they stewed in panic, I continued to tighten my control behind the scenes. The regulatory investigation into their unauthorized pipeline had progressed quickly. Once I ensured the right documents landed on the right desks, soon state inspectors would appear, and the HOA would have no choice but to explain how they'd bulldozed private property without permits. Their fines would be catastrophic. Their liability would be undeniable. Still, I waited, because the most painful downfall is one inflicted by one's own impatience. On the 8th day, Cedar Ridge attempted a workaround. A massive water delivery truck rumbled into their gated entrance, an expensive bandage for a bleeding system. It pumped precious gallons into their reservoir, barely enough to keep basic usage operational for 24 hours. It was a temporary lifeline, and everyone knew it. More trucks would cost more money the HOA did not have, and every hour, evaporation ate away at the emergency supply. That afternoon, I received a final attempt at diplomacy, a personal letter from Marlene herself. The handwriting was neat and practiced, but the ink wavered slightly, betraying her unraveling composure. She appealed to shared humanity. She spoke of children in the neighborhood, of elderly residents suffering without irrigation or decorative fountains. She insisted the HOA had only wanted to secure stability for their community. She ended with a plea, a request to meet face-to-face and negotiate a cooperative future. It would have been almost touching if it hadn't come from the same woman who once pretended I didn't exist. I set the letter aside, letting its words settle into irrelevance, because the time for polite requests had long passed. Tomorrow, the inspectors would arrive. Tomorrow, Cedar Ridge would discover that their shiny new pipeline wasn't just useless, it was illegal, and when the state forced them to tear it out piece by expensive piece, they would finally understand the true cost of trespassing against someone who doesn't lose. I locked my gate and walked back toward the house as night cradled the ranch in silence. The creek flowed steadily beneath the stars, untouched and eternal. Water has memory, and so do I. Their suffering was only beginning. Morning broke with the sound of official vehicles rumbling down the winding road toward Cedar Ridge Estates. Black SUVs with government plates, state inspectors in collared shirts, clipboards already poised like weapons. There was no advance notice, not for the residents, not for the board. Panic bubbled the moment they stepped foot onto the sacred turf of the neighborhood's entrance. The inspectors didn't bother with pleasantries. They informed the HOA that they had received multiple credible reports of unauthorized construction of public works infrastructure. They asked for permits. They asked for easement records. They asked for any documentation proving legal right to run a water pipeline across private land. There was nothing. The board looked around helplessly, as if documents might magically appear when pressured enough. Marlene frantically flipped through binders and folders, her hands trembling, her voice cracking as she insisted everything was in order, though she could not produce anything resembling proof. The lead inspector did not hide his skepticism. He informed them bluntly that construction must cease immediately and that the entire project was subject to removal pending further investigation. Penalties would be assessed. Liability would be assigned. Despair washed over the HOA like drought across a once green lawn. Residents gathered at the clubhouse, their faces drawn with worry and rage. Voices rose. People demanded explanations, demanded heads roll, demanded someone, anyone, fix the disaster unraveling before them. Chaos took hold, spreading through the cul-de-sacs, and perfectly painted picket fences. The board issued statements blaming unexpected regulatory delays. They shushed the angriest residents and begged for patience they had never shown anyone else. They were losing them, one furious homeowner at a time. As noon approached, Marlene returned to my gate. This time, she didn't honk. She didn't yell. She simply stood there, shoulders slouched, the weight of crushed confidence breaking her posture. When I stepped outside and approached, she looked small, shrunk by consequences she never thought would arrive. She didn't try to charm her way through it. She didn't threaten me. She didn't pull out PDFs or agreements or legal jargon. She begged. Her voice was raw, as she confessed the pipeline was the HOA's desperate attempt to reduce costs. She admitted they thought bypassing established channels would secure affordable water for decades. They had chosen to act first and apologize later, assuming I would buckle under pressure and allow it. She claimed it was never personal. But trespassing always is. She asked for one thing: water restored while they worked through the legal details. She said families were suffering. She said the community was falling apart. She said the HOA would compensate me for any trouble. Her desperation poured out like runoff in a storm. For the first time, I spoke. Calm. Controlled. A voice carved from generations of land stewardship. I explained that control of the water supply was not simply a business matter, it was a matter of responsibility, one the HOA had undermined with reckless entitlement. Then I handed her a folder, one that contained the truth she never thought to consider. Inside was documentation proving that High Plains Water Corporation, the very company Cedar Ridge once depended on, was not some faceless corporate entity they could push aside. It was my legacy, my family's work, my authority. Marlene's face drained of color as she read the shareholder breakdown, showing my name at the top. Majority owner. Unquestionable authority over their access. The creek whose flow they depended on? It was monitored under my jurisdiction. The land on which their precious pipeline sat? Mine. Entirely. She staggered back a step, realization crashing over her like a burst dam. The enemy they thought they could bully owned the very resource they needed to survive. The HOA was not just powerless. Its entire plan existed only by my grace. I did not raise my voice. I did not boast. I simply presented her a written agreement, something simple, clear, and fair. The HOA would remove the pipeline. They would restore every inch of my land to its original condition. They would issue a public apology, printed in their newsletter, mailed to all residents. They would acknowledge their wrongdoing openly, without excuses. And finally, they would renew their contract. With High Plains Water for long-term supply, at the original rates, they had once scoffed at, water would return the moment those terms were signed. Marlene, read the document once, twice. Her fingers trembled. She understood immediately that she had no negotiating ground left. Humiliation stung her like acid, but survival outweighed pride. Now, without another word, she signed. As soon as her pen lifted from the page, I made a single phone call. The intake opened. Water flowed. Sprinklers sputtered back to life. Fountains sprayed triumphantly once more. Residents cheered, not for their leadership, but for relief. They had no idea that the very man they'd vilified was the only reason they now heard the soft hiss of life returning to their lawns. The inspectors stayed to oversee compliance. Crews began dismantling the illegal pipeline under strict supervision, piece by metal piece. The land was refilled, reseeded, and refenced exactly as it had been before their intrusion. Cedar Ridge paid the fines. The HOA felt the financial pain. Their reserve funds drained faster than their sprinklers had dried up. The apology arrived in my mailbox 2 weeks later, printed on premium cardstock, embossed with the Cedar Ridge logo, as if the strength of paper could soften the blow. They acknowledged their overreach. They admitted fault. They promised better respect for neighboring properties and lawful boundaries. It was the first honest thing they had ever sent me. Life returned to routine. My cattle grazed undisturbed. The creek flowed cleanly, untouched by unapproved pumps. The land healed. As for the HOA, things changed. Residents voted out the board at the next meeting. New leadership took control, more humble, more cautious, more aware of the power structures they once dismissed. I heard Marlene moved away not long after, somewhere without creeks, I hoped. Weeks later, I stood by the water under the shade of the old oaks, feeling the weight of silence finally lift. The land was peaceful once more, protected, safe. People forget that water is life, until it's gone. But I never forget, because this ranch is not just dirt and grass. It is history, loyalty, legacy, and no HOA, no matter how smug or entitled, will ever take that from me. The pipeline was gone. The lesson remained. Out here, respect is the only currency that matters, and those who don't pay it eventually learn what it costs.